It was a quiet Saturday afternoon, one of those rare days when she finally had a few hours to herself. After an exhausting week of meetings, reports, and late-night calls, she just wanted a normal day. No badge, no uniform, no responsibilities. She parked her car in front of a large department store, the kind that sold everything from groceries to clothes to small electronics. She had a short list in her head, a gift for her niece's birthday, some shampoo, and maybe a pair of comfortable shoes. Nothing special, just small things that made her feel like an ordinary person for a change. She walked in through the sliding glass doors, smiling at the greeter by habit. Years of being in law enforcement had trained her to acknowledge people, to make eye contact, to be kind first. The store was busy but not chaotic. Families were pushing carts, teenagers laughed by the cosmetics aisle, and an old couple debated over the price of a coffee maker. It was the kind of everyday scene she always found oddly comforting. For once, nobody knew she was a police captain. She was just another shopper in a hoodie and jeans. She started in the women's section, picking up a few items for her niece. A colorful backpack caught her eye, and she imagined her niece's face lighting up at the sight of it. She smiled to herself and held it close for a moment. Then she walked toward the small accessories section, comparing a few items and reading price tags. She was relaxed, her mind far from work, far from the endless pressure that came with her position. She didn't notice the subtle shift in the air, the way two store employees had started glancing toward her aisle, whispering quietly to each other. After a while, she placed the backpack in her cart and moved toward the beauty aisle. She picked up a few bottles of shampoo, a small lotion, and a perfume tester that smelled nice. As she read the label, she realized she had left her wallet in the car. She frowned a little, setting the perfume back. It wasn't far, just a quick walk outside to the parking lot and back. She decided to leave her cart near the aisle and step out to get her wallet. She didn't think twice about it. It was something any shopper might do. But the moment she started walking toward the exit, one of the store security staff noticed. He had been watching her from a distance, misinterpreting every innocent move. When she picked up and put back items, he thought she was trying to hide them. When she looked around to find the quickest way to the parking lot, he assumed she was nervous. Now, as she walked toward the door, he became certain he was seeing a thief trying to leave without paying. The captain was halfway to the doors when she heard someone calling out behind her. It wasn't a friendly tone. She turned slightly, confused, but saw no one clearly. Thinking it was probably not directed at her, she continued walking. She was still inside the store, still beneath the bright fluorescent lights when two uniformed police officers entered quickly through the main doors. Their eyes scanned the area, guided by the store security guard who pointed directly at her. In seconds, they were walking fast in her direction. She stopped, surprised by the sight. Her instinct as an officer kicked in, but before she could speak, one of them raised his voice. "Ma'am, stop right there." The tone was firm, commanding, the kind of tone she herself had used countless times on duty. She froze, still calm but confused. One of the officers stepped closer, his hand near his belt. "We got a call about a suspected shoplifter," he said. "We need to talk to you." Her brows furrowed slightly. "A shoplifter? I think there's a misunderstanding. I haven't left the store and I was just going to my car to get my wallet," she explained, her voice steady but gentle. Years of training kept her from sounding defensive, but her calmness seemed to irritate them more, as if they took it as resistance. "Ma'am, please don't move," the other officer said sharply. "Do you have any receipts or proof of purchase for what's in your cart?" She turned to look at her cart still near the aisle, confused by how fast things had escalated. "I haven't bought anything yet," she replied. "I told you my wallet is in my car." One of the officers exchanged a glance with his partner, then looked at her again, more suspicious now. "Can we see your ID?" "Of course," she said, reaching into her pocket for her phone. "My ID is in the car with my wallet, but I can show you my—" "Ma'am, step aside, please," the officer interrupted. His voice was louder this time, his stance firm. People had started to notice. Shoppers slowed their carts, parents whispered to their kids, and phones quietly came out to record. She could feel every pair of eyes on her. The woman who commanded a full police precinct suddenly stood there, feeling powerless. She took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. "Officers, please listen to me. I'm a police." But before she could finish, one of them grabbed her wrist, turning her around as the other reached for his cuffs. "You can explain that later," he said coldly. "Right now, you're being detained. The cold metal closed around her wrists. It was a sound she knew well, one she had heard hundreds of times in her career but never imagined she'd hear directed at herself. The store fell silent. A few people gasped, some shook their heads, and a woman in the corner whispered, "Oh my God, they're arresting her." She didn't resist. She didn't shout. She just looked down, her voice low but steady. "You're making a mistake." They escorted her through the store, past aisles of wide-eyed shoppers and employees whispering behind their hands. The embarrassment cut deeper than the handcuffs. She thought of her years of service, decades spent building trust, leading younger officers, handling some of the toughest cases in her city. Yet here she was, treated like a criminal in a place where she had only come to buy a few simple things. Outside, the air felt colder. One officer guided her toward the patrol car, while the other radioed in. She stood there quietly, her heart heavy, her dignity fighting to stay intact. "Please," she said softly, "my car is right there. My wallet and ID are inside. You'll find my badge too." Her tone, even in that moment, was calm and composed. It made the younger officer pause. He looked at his partner, uncertain. "She says she has ID in her car," he muttered. The senior one hesitated, then sighed. "Fine, check it." The younger officer walked to her car, directed by her instructions. When he opened the glove compartment and saw the leather badge case inside, his expression changed instantly. He pulled it out, opened it, and stared at the shiny police captain's badge staring back at him. His throat tightened. He turned slowly toward her, realization dawning on his face. He walked back quickly, holding the badge in his hand. "Sir," he said quietly to his partner, "she's one of us. She's a captain." The senior officer's face went pale. His eyes darted between her and the badge, disbelief clouding his voice. What did you say?" He took the badge, inspected it, and looked up at her, suddenly nervous. "Ma'am, Captain, We had no idea." She didn't respond right away. The silence stretched as the two men fumbled to remove the cuffs. Her wrists were red where the metal had pressed into her skin. "We're so sorry," the younger one said quickly. "We were just following protocol. The store called in." She looked at him calmly, her voice low but steady. Protocol doesn't mean assuming guilt before listening. She wasn't angry in the way they expected. She was disappointed, deeply disappointed. The store security guard had come outside by then, confusion on his face as he realized the gravity of what had just happened. "Ma'am, I thought," he began, but stopped when she turned her gaze toward him. It wasn't harsh, but it was powerful enough to make him look down. The officers apologized again, stumbling over their words. They offered to call a supervisor, to file a report, to make things right. But she simply shook her head. "No need," she said quietly. "Just learn from this." She sat in her car for a long time after they left, her hands resting on the steering wheel. The badge lay on the passenger seat, glinting in the sunlight. She stared at it, thinking about what had just happened. For all her years of service, all the respect she had earned, one moment without her uniform had stripped away everything people thought they knew about her. To them, she was just another woman who fit a story they were too quick to believe. She finally took a deep breath, started the engine, and drove away. Not angry, but thoughtful. The drive home was quiet, the kind that made her think about how easily perception can turn into prejudice, how simple mistakes can reveal deeper truths about the world she lived in. She had spent her whole career teaching young officers to look closer, to see people as human beings first. But today, she had become a lesson herself. That night, she sat by her window watching the city lights flicker in the distance. She didn't tell anyone what happened. Not yet. She needed time to understand it herself. But deep down, she knew this day would not be forgotten. It would stay with her, not as a scar, but as a reminder of how much work still needed to be done. The next morning, sunlight streamed softly through the blinds, but she didn't move right away. She had barely slept. Every time she closed her eyes, the same scene replayed in her mind. The shouting, the cuffs, the stares, the disbelief in people's eyes. She could still feel the coldness of the metal on her wrists. It wasn't just the physical discomfort that bothered her. It was the feeling of being unseen, of not being recognized for who she truly was. After years of service, training, and leadership, she had been treated like a suspect in seconds. She sat up slowly and rubbed her wrists where faint red marks still showed. They were almost gone, but she could still feel them. She made herself a cup of coffee and sat by the window. Outside, the neighborhood was peaceful. People were walking their dogs, a child rode a bike, and a delivery truck rumbled past. Life went on as if nothing had happened. But inside, she was still turning over the weight of what she'd experienced. Her phone buzzed on the table, a message from one of her fellow officers asking if she was coming to the community safety meeting that afternoon. She stared at the message for a long moment before replying with a simple, yes. She wasn't sure how she would face them yet, but part of her knew she couldn't just hide away. When she arrived at the station later that day, she wore her uniform. The polished badge gleamed against the dark fabric. It felt like armor now, something that gave her a kind of protection she hadn't realized she relied on until yesterday. The young officers greeted her respectfully as always, calling her Captain. Some saluted, others smiled politely. No one could have imagined that the same woman standing there with authority had been handcuffed in a parking lot less than 24 hours earlier. The meeting began as usual, filled with updates, reports, and discussions about upcoming community programs. But her mind wandered. Every word about fair treatment and community trust felt heavier now. She kept thinking about how easily trust could be broken, not just between police and the public, but within oneself. After the meeting, one of her colleagues, a sergeant she had known for years, stopped her in the hallway. "You look tired," he said gently. "Everything okay?" She hesitated. For a moment she thought about brushing it off, pretending it was just a long week. But something inside her refused to hide this time. "Something happened yesterday," she said quietly. "At the store," the sergeant frowned. "What kind of something?" She told him the story, from walking into the store to the moment the handcuffs clicked. His expression shifted from confusion to disbelief to anger. "They handcuffed you?" he asked, his voice low but tense. She nodded. "They thought I was stealing. The officers didn't recognize me. I tried to explain, but they didn't listen until they found my badge in the car." He exhaled slowly, shaking his head. "That's unbelievable. Did you file a complaint?" "No," she said, her tone calm but firm. "I don't want to ruin anyone's career. I just want them to learn from it. But I can't pretend it didn't happen either." He nodded slowly, clearly struggling to process it. "You've spent your life teaching people about fairness, about slowing down and seeing the whole picture. And they didn't even give you that." Her eyes softened. "That's what hurts the most." For the rest of the day, she worked quietly in her office, reviewing reports, answering emails, doing everything she could to stay focused. But every now and then her mind would drift. She thought about how many times she had told her team, "Never let your bias lead your actions." She thought about all the people who had been judged unfairly, whose stories might never be heard because they didn't have a badge or title to make people listen afterward. That evening, she got a call from the department's public relations officer. Word about the incident had reached him through another officer. He sounded careful, choosing his words slowly. "Captain, I heard about what happened. Are you all right?" "I'm fine," she said, though she wasn't sure if it was true. He paused. "You know, if this ever gets out, the media might pick it up. We could prepare a statement if you want." She closed her eyes for a moment. "No statements?" she said softly. "Not yet. I don't want this to turn into a headline. I just want people to understand what it means." That night she went for a long drive. The city lights blurred outside the window as she passed familiar streets and neighborhoods she had patrolled for years. She remembered the nights she had helped lost kids find their parents, the mornings she'd comforted victims, the times she'd stood between people and danger. Every memory reminded her why she had joined the force in the first place, to make people feel safe. But now she was the one who had felt unsafe, and that realization cut deeper than she expected. She parked by the waterfront, where the air smelled faintly of salt and the waves lapped softly against the rocks. The reflection of the city shimmered on the water. She sat there quietly, thinking. What happened at the store wasn't just about her. It was about something larger, something that many people faced every day but never had the power to speak about. She thought about how her uniform gave her a shield that others didn't have, and how easily it had disappeared the moment she took it off. The next morning, she woke up feeling different. Not angry, not bitter, but determined. She decided she wouldn't let the experience end as just another bad memory. She wanted to do something meaningful with it. At work, she called for a meeting with the training department. The officers were surprised when she entered the room. "I want to discuss something important," she began. "We need to include a new session in our training, something focused on how we approach people, how we see them. How we treat them before we know who they are. The training supervisor nodded slowly, curious. Are you referring to bias awareness? Yes, she said firmly. But not just that. I want it to be personal. I want officers to think about what it feels like to be on the other side. To be questioned, doubted, or humiliated for something you didn't do. The room was quiet for a moment. Then one of the younger officers asked, Did something happen, Captain? She paused, then looked around the room. Yes, she said simply. Something did happen. And it showed me that even the best among us can make mistakes if we stop seeing people as human first. The officers listened closely. There was something about the way she spoke, steady, sincere, without anger, that made the message stronger. She didn't mention the details of her own experience, but they could sense the weight behind her words. Over the next few days, she began to work with the training team to develop the new program. They talked about communication, observation, patience, and empathy. She shared real examples from the field, including moments when she herself had almost jumped to conclusions. She wasn't there to lecture. She was there to make them think. One afternoon, as she was leaving the station, she saw one of the officers who had been present at her meeting. He stopped her and said, Captain, what you said really made me think. I realized how quick I can be to assume things when I'm on duty. I'm going to try to do better. She smiled faintly. That's all I ask. One step at a time. A few days later, she received a letter from the department chief who had heard about the new initiative. He praised her for turning a painful experience into something that could make the entire department better. Reading the letter, she felt a quiet sense of peace. It didn't erase what had happened, but it made the memory less heavy. Later that week, she visited the same store again. It took courage to walk back through those sliding doors, but she wanted to face it. The moment she entered, a familiar store manager recognized her instantly. He looked nervous, his expression filled with regret. Ma'am, I don't know what to say. I'm so sorry about what happened. I wish we had handled things differently. She looked at him calmly. I appreciate that, she said softly. I didn't come here for an apology. I came because I don't want fear to control where I go. I just want you and your staff to remember what this felt like. For both of us. The manager nodded, visibly moved. I will. I promise. She walked through the aisles again, this time with no eyes following her, no whispers behind her back. She bought the same backpack she had picked up that day, paid for it, and smiled as she left. It wasn't about the backpack anymore. It was about reclaiming her peace. That night, she wrapped the gift for her niece and placed it on the table. For the first time in days, she felt light again. She knew there were still people out there who would face the same unfairness, the same assumptions, but maybe, just maybe, her story could make a small difference. And sometimes that was enough to start change. The next week felt strange for her. The days went on as usual, but nothing really felt the same. The incident at the store was no longer fresh in her mind, yet it stayed with her in quiet moments. Sometimes when she stopped at a traffic light or waited in line somewhere, her thoughts drifted back to it. The looks from strangers, the firm voices, the way she had felt invisible. She didn't let those thoughts turn into bitterness, but she couldn't deny how deeply they had changed her view of things. At the station, work had picked up pace again. There were new cases to review, patrol schedules to approve, and officers to mentor. But even as she focused on her duties, she noticed herself paying more attention to small things. How younger officers interacted with people, how they spoke to those they stopped on the street, even how they looked at others who didn't fit their idea of normal. Before, these moments might have passed unnoticed. Now she saw them all with new eyes. One morning, she sat quietly in the briefing room as a group of rookies prepared for their first community patrol. She listened as their supervisor gave instructions, reminding them about procedures and safety. When the briefing ended, she stepped forward and spoke gently. Before you go, I want to share something with you. It won't take long. The room fell silent. The rookies respected her deeply. She was known for being fair but firm. She stood there for a moment, gathering her thoughts. When you meet people out there, she began, remember that the way you look at them can change everything. You might think you're just doing your job, but how you speak, how you listen, it all matters more than you realize. They watched her carefully. She continued, sometimes you'll be sure you're right about what you see, but being right and being fair aren't always the same thing. Don't rush to decide who someone is before you give them a chance to speak. One of the rookies asked softly, "Did something happen, Captain?" She gave a small smile. Something did. And it taught me that uniforms and titles don't always protect us from judgment. Anyone can be misunderstood. The young officers nodded slowly, some looking thoughtful, others clearly moved. It wasn't a lecture, just a quiet reminder, but it stayed with them. Later, one of them would tell her privately, "I think I'll remember that more than anything from training." A few days later, an invitation came for her to speak at a local community event. The organizers wanted her to talk about trust between police and citizens. It was a topic she had spoken on many times before, but this time felt different. She agreed without hesitation. When the evening arrived, she stood behind the small podium at a community hall filled with familiar faces: residents, shop owners, teachers, even a few city council members. She looked around and smiled warmly. "Good evening," she began. "I want to talk to you tonight not as a police captain, but as a person who learned something recently about how fragile trust can be." The audience listened closely. Her voice was calm but carried emotion. "A few weeks ago, something happened that reminded me how quickly we can judge each other based on what we see, not who we are. I experienced it myself, and I can tell you, it changes how you see the world." She didn't share every detail of what had happened, but she spoke from the heart about bias, misunderstanding, and the importance of empathy. "We can't fix everything overnight," she said softly. "But we can start by seeing each other as people, not categories. If we do that, we'll already be one step closer to real trust." When she finished, there was silence for a moment before the room erupted in quiet applause. A few people came up afterward to thank her, some with tears in their eyes. One woman, an elderly resident who had lived in the city her entire life, held her hand and said, "Thank you for speaking truth with grace. We needed to hear that." That night, as she drove home, she felt lighter. She didn't need to tell the world every detail of her story. It was enough to turn it into something meaningful, something that might help others think twice before making the same mistakes. Still, the journey wasn't easy. There were moments when the memory came back suddenly. When she walked into a store, when she saw a police car outside a shopping center, when she caught a certain look from someone that reminded her of that day. It wasn't fear. It was something deeper, a quiet ache that reminded her of her own vulnerability. One afternoon, while reviewing reports in her office, she received a message from the city's Internal Affairs Division. They had learned about the incident and wanted to conduct a standard review, just to ensure all procedures had been properly followed by the responding officers. She sighed, knowing it was routine but also knowing it would stir up the past again. She agreed to meet with them. During the meeting, 2 investigators asked her to describe what happened. She spoke calmly and honestly, leaving nothing out but never exaggerating. When she finished, one of them said quietly, "Captain, I can't imagine what that must have felt like." She nodded. "It wasn't easy. But I don't want this to be about me. I just wanted to help make things better for others." They promised to review the case carefully. A few weeks later, they contacted her again to tell her that the officers involved had been required to attend additional training on de-escalation and bias awareness. She appreciated that decision. She didn't want punishment, she wanted growth. Around that same time, she received a handwritten note at the station. It was from one of the officers who had arrested her that day. The note was short but sincere. "Captain," it began, "I want to apologize again for what happened. I've thought about that day every single day since. I was so focused on doing what I thought was right that I forgot to see the person in front of me. You didn't raise your voice and you didn't humiliate me even though you could have. I'll never forget that. I'm truly sorry and I promise I'll do better." She read the note twice, then folded it carefully and placed it in her desk drawer. She didn't need to respond. The letter itself was enough. It showed that something had changed. Maybe not everything, but something. As the weeks passed, she found herself invited to more community discussions. Schools, churches, and even youth groups asked her to speak about fairness, respect, and understanding. She never framed herself as a victim. Instead, she spoke about lessons, growth, and empathy. People listened, not because she was a captain, but because she spoke with honesty. One afternoon, she visited a local high school where students were hosting a respect and awareness program. She sat on a small stage beside teachers and student leaders. When it was her turn to speak, she looked at the students, some curious, some distracted, some shy, and said, One day, someone will look at you and think they know who you are just by what they see. When that happens, remember how it feels. Then promise yourself you'll never do that to someone else. The students listened more closely after that. A few even stayed behind after the event to thank her. One young girl said quietly, "I didn't think police officers could go through things like that. It makes me see you differently." She smiled warmly. "We're all human," she replied. "Every one of us." Months passed, and slowly the memory of that painful day began to lose its sting. It didn't disappear, but it turned into something useful. A reminder that even strong people can be humbled, and even painful experiences can lead to good change. Sometimes, when she walked into her office early in the morning before the day began, she would glance at her badge resting on her desk. It no longer felt like just a symbol of authority. It felt like a responsibility, a promise to make sure no one else had to go through what she did. One evening, as she was leaving the station, she paused in the hallway. The walls were lined with photos of officers past and present, smiling faces, award ceremonies, moments frozen in time. She looked at those faces and thought about how many stories each one carried, how many lessons had been learned the hard way. Then she smiled softly to herself. What had happened to her would never fully go away, but she had turned it into something greater. It wasn't just her story anymore. It was a reminder to others that compassion mattered more than judgment, and that true strength wasn't about authority, but about understanding. That night, she drove home beneath a calm sky, the city lights twinkling like distant stars. She rolled down the window, letting the cool air touch her face. For the first time in a long while, she felt peace. Not because everything was perfect, but because she had found meaning in the imperfection. She had been through humiliation, anger, reflection, and growth. But now she was moving forward, not as someone marked by what happened, but as someone shaped by it. She had turned pain into purpose, and that was something no one could take from her. Months had passed since the day at the store, but the memory still lingered quietly in her heart. Life had returned to normal on the surface. Meetings, briefings, patrol reports, long days at the station. But something inside her had changed. She had always believed in fairness, but now she understood it differently. Fairness wasn't just about following rules. It was about understanding people before making decisions about them. Her work had taken on a new kind of meaning. She was still strict when she needed to be, but her patience had grown deeper. When young officers made mistakes, she guided them calmly instead of scolding. When citizens complained, she listened fully before responding. It was as if that single moment of humiliation had opened a door in her, one that let empathy in even more than before. One morning, she arrived at the station early. The sun was just rising, painting the sky with soft gold and orange. She sat in her office with a cup of coffee, staring at a folder filled with community feedback from their new training program. The program she had started after her experience was now being praised across the department. Officers were sharing stories of how they handled situations differently, with more patience, more listening, and more respect. That made her proud. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock at the door. One of her lieutenants stepped in looking slightly nervous. "Captain," he said, "there's a reporter asking for you. From the local news. She says she wants to talk about the community project." She hesitated for a second. She usually avoided interviews, preferring to let her work speak for itself. But then she thought of all the people who had reached out to her quietly after hearing bits of her story. People who felt seen because of it. Maybe sharing more openly could help others too. She nodded. "All right. Send her in." The reporter was polite, young, and eager. She set her recorder on the desk and smiled nervously. "Thank you for meeting with me, Captain. I've been following the new training initiative you launched, and it's really inspiring. I wanted to know what led you to start it." The captain looked at her for a moment, then gave a small smile. "Sometimes the best lessons come from the hardest experiences," she said softly. The reporter leaned forward. "Was there a specific event that inspired it?" There was a pause. She looked out the window for a moment before turning back. "Yes," she said. "There was." She spoke carefully, choosing her words with honesty but without bitterness. She described how she had been mistaken for a shoplifter, how the situation had unfolded, and how she decided to turn that pain into something useful. The reporter listened silently, her eyes wide with empathy. "That must have been very difficult," she said quietly. "It was," the captain admitted. But it also taught me something. It reminded me that even good people can make wrong assumptions. We just have to be willing to see our mistakes and grow from them. When the interview was over, the reporter thanked her sincerely. "I think a lot of people will learn from your story," she said before leaving. The article came out a week later. It was titled, "From Humiliation to Healing, a Captain's Story of Change." It spread quickly online. People commented not with anger, but with admiration. They appreciated her honesty and strength. Some shared their own experiences of being judged unfairly. Others thanked her for setting an example of forgiveness instead of resentment. Her phone buzzed constantly for a few days. Messages from other departments, community leaders, and even ordinary citizens. One message came from a retired officer who wrote, "I made mistakes like that once. Your story made me think about them differently. Thank you." Another message came from a woman who said her teenage son had been stopped unfairly before, and hearing the captain's story made her feel hopeful again. She read every message, one by one, feeling both humbled and moved. For the first time, she truly realized how far-reaching a single act of understanding could go. One afternoon, the chief called her into his office. He smiled as she entered. "I've been reading the reactions to your story," he said. "You've made this department proud," she smiled politely. "I just told the truth," she replied. The chief nodded. "That's exactly why people trust you. I want you to represent us at the state conference next month. They're hosting a session on bias training, and I can't think of anyone better to speak." She agreed, though the idea made her a little nervous. Public speaking wasn't new to her, but this time the story was personal. She wanted to make sure she spoke not from a place of blame, but from hope. When the day of the conference came, she stood before a room full of officers, leaders, and educators from across the state. Cameras were set up, lights were bright, and everyone was waiting to hear what she had to say. She took a deep breath and began. "I'm not here today to talk about policies or numbers," she said. "I'm here to talk about something more personal, the power of perception." The room was silent as she told her story, not dramatized, but simply told as it was. She described the confusion, the embarrassment, and the reflection that followed. She explained how she had used that experience to start a program focused on empathy and awareness. "When we wear this uniform," she said softly, "we carry power, but that power means nothing if we lose sight of humanity. The people we meet each day are not just faces or files. They're stories, families, and feelings. We must see them fully before we decide who they are." Her words were met with quiet respect. When she finished, the room stood in applause. Some officers even approached her afterward, saying they saw themselves in her words. One told her, "You made me think about a traffic stop I handled last week. I could have done better." That night, as she sat alone in her hotel room, she looked out at the city skyline and let out a deep breath. The applause had been nice, but what mattered more was knowing that maybe, just maybe, her words had reached someone's heart. A few weeks later, she was invited to a local school for a career inspiration day. Dozens of students gathered in the gym, their faces full of curiosity. When it was her turn to speak, she didn't talk much about ranks or promotions. Instead, she said, "When you grow up, people will judge you. Sometimes they'll be wrong. But don't let that harden you. Let it teach you. Let it make you stronger." Afterward, a boy came up to her quietly. He said his father had once been arrested for something he didn't do, and since then he didn't trust police officers. But after hearing her talk, he said he wanted to believe that some officers truly cared. That small moment touched her deeply. As the months rolled on, her story continued to ripple out quietly. Other departments reached out for guidance on how to start similar training. Her schedule filled with meetings, but she never lost her calmness. She stayed humble, reminding herself that everything she was doing came from one painful day that she had chosen not to let define her. Still, there were times when the memory would return suddenly. A sound, a face in a crowd, or just a quiet evening when she sat alone. Those moments reminded her that she was still human, still healing. But she no longer saw the incident as something that broke her. She saw it as something that built her differently, stronger, wiser, and softer at the same time. One evening, she visited her niece, who was playing in the living room with the backpack she had bought months ago. The little girl laughed, showing her all the stickers she had placed on it. Watching her, the captain smiled gently. The laughter filled the room like music, washing away the heaviness that had followed her for so long. Later that night, when she drove home, she passed the same department store. For a brief moment, she considered stopping, just to see it again, but she didn't need to. She had already found peace. The store was just a place. What mattered was how far she had come since that day. As she parked at home, she sat for a moment, hands on the steering wheel, feeling grateful. Life had tested her, but it had also shown her what kind of person she truly was. She had turned pain into purpose, misunderstanding into education, and humiliation into healing. When she stepped out of the car, the night was cool and quiet. She looked up at the sky and smiled softly. The stars seemed brighter that night, or maybe she was just finally seeing them clearly. The year was slowly coming to an end. The air had that calm feeling of winter, where the streets grow quieter and people move a little slower. For the captain, life had found a steady rhythm again. Her days were filled with meetings, training sessions, and community visits. Yet deep inside, she felt something changing, something she couldn't quite explain. It wasn't about healing anymore. It was about growing. She had made peace with what happened, but now she wanted to make something good out of it. Something lasting. One chilly morning, she was invited to speak at a community forum about trust between police and citizens. The event was being held in the same city where everything had happened almost a year ago. For a moment, she hesitated when she saw the invitation. The memories were still there, just quieter now, but she knew this was where she was meant to be. The hall was filled with people, students, officers, parents, and store owners. She noticed a few of the same officers who had been there that day sitting in the back, listening quietly. She didn't hold any bitterness toward them anymore. They had reached out months ago to apologize again, and over time she had seen real change in them. They had started volunteering in the community training program she helped create. That gave her a sense of quiet pride. When it was her turn to speak, she stood at the podium, looked around the room, and smiled softly. "When I walked into a store 1 year ago," she began, "I never imagined that day would change me in so many ways. At first it felt like a wound I couldn't hide, but over time it became a lesson, one that taught me more about humanity than all my years of service ever did." The room stayed silent, every eye on her. She continued, her tone calm but warm. "That day I was judged before I could speak, and the people who judged me weren't bad people. They were people who made a quick decision without understanding the full story. I've learned that this happens every day, in stores, on streets, and schools, everywhere. What matters isn't just what happened to me, but what I decided to do after." She went on to talk about the programs her department had launched, workshops on empathy, training sessions on bias, and community meetings where officers and citizens sat together, not as strangers but as neighbors. "It's not about blame," she said. "It's about building bridges where fear used to be." When she finished speaking, the crowd applauded, but it wasn't loud or dramatic. It was steady and heartfelt, the kind of applause that carries respect instead of excitement. Afterward, people came up to her one by one to thank her. Some shared their own experiences of being judged unfairly. Others said her words gave them hope that change was possible, even in small steps. After the event, she stepped outside. The air was cool and the sun was setting behind the buildings. She stood there for a moment, taking a slow breath. She could still remember that afternoon at the store so clearly, the confusion, the shame, the disbelief. But now standing here, it felt like a lifetime ago.